Welcome to Native Bidaské, Native News Online's weekly spotlight on the people making news and leading change in Indian country.
Welcome to another episode of Native Bidaské. I'm Levi Rickert, publisher and editor of Native News Online. This is our last episode for 2022. We're going to move into 2023 in a couple days. And so we wanted to actually talk to the president of the National Congress of American Indians, Fawn Sharp. Welcome, President Sharp. So good to see you, and Happy New Year. Just a couple of days early, but yes.
Yes, Happy New Year. Thank you for the invitation. It is, we're down to the last business day here before going into a brand new year. So I'm happy and delighted to be here. So thank you for the invite.
Yeah. Well, tell us this, in terms of success in what you guys have gone through at the National Congress of American Indians this past year. What do you want to talk about in terms of where you've been, and let's talk about what's going on in 2023.
Yes, absolutely. I think, a year ago, we were coming out of a pandemic, and it seemed like we were exhausted and tired, but yet we knew we had a lot of issues on the horizon and a lot of opportunity. And I think in reflecting back on 2022, it's quite clear, as it is every single year when we stop and reflect on all the accomplishments of Indian country, there's no question when we come together, we can confront and continue to advance tribal sovereignty, advance the issues that have been collectively worked on, not only for our generation, but generations of tribal leaders that have gone before us. And I think 2022 was another example of that. If you look at healthcare, for example, achieving advanced appropriations for healthcare was an accomplishment. If you consider education and all the initiatives around tribal languages, that was a historic win. And we're not only advancing that with the White House, but certainly different pieces of legislation. And then when you turn to things like climate change, we were able to accomplish unprecedented resources at a time when tribes so desperately need that help. Law enforcement, look at what we did in VAWA, restoring another element of tribal criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians who commit crimes on our reservation. And then economic development. We have Lynn Malerba, who's the very first Native American as the U.S. Treasurer, who's now going to lead an entire division related to taxation and tribal economic development. So every single sector that you look at, we're achieving a lot, and we have achieved a lot in 2022. So it really is an exciting time of the year just to take stock and think about this era of a global pandemic and just the challenges that were confronted. And we not only met the challenges of the pandemic, it didn't stop us from keeping our eye on that vision and goal that not only this generation of tribal leaders have, but all those that have gone before us, and seizing it and unleashing the voice of Indian country to seize this moment. So a very exciting time of the year.
It is. And you said so much. I have several questions, but let me just start with this one. It seems to me, since the Biden administration, been a good time for Indian country. Would you agree? And how do we continue this? Even obviously we have 2 years left of his administration, and hopefully more. But it's Levi Rickert ad-lib there. But no. What would you say? Why is President Biden so strong towards Indian country?
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. From the moment he was sworn in and took office, it was just a matter of days when I remember thinking back the first 2 weeks of his administration. I'd been on the phone multiple times in that first 2 weeks on different policies. As you recall, one of the initial things he did was, let's talk about meaningful tribal consultation. And during this last White House Tribal Nations Summit, he announced that we're taking another step closer to our vision for political equity. And in my mind, political equity means that we should be able to consult with the United States and have equal bargaining position at the table, where the United States simply doesn't consult, check the box, and then proceed with a predetermined unilateral course of action. We heard that they're now going to be achieving consensus, which achieves our goal of not having unilateral action. It's not quite consent, which is our vision for a meaningful relationship, but we're another step closer. And that is truly historic. It's not only for domestic policy, but now the United States has standing as a matter of foreign policy to ensure that countries around the world will respect the rights of Indigenous peoples the way they were designed and intended. And so early in just within days of his presidency, it was very clear to us that we have a partner that not only understands the relationship that we have with the United States, but wants to truly get behind our vision for how we're going to accomplish and achieve the goals. And then the unprecedented number of appointments, starting with Deb Haaland as the first Secretary of Interior, and then just all the other appointees that we have in these key positions that are central to our agenda for Indian country, whether it is at Interior or the Department of Treasury or OMB. So this president has done an incredible amount for Indian country in just a relatively short period of time. And it's exciting. And as you point out, 2 more years left. And I'm excited to see what's on the horizon over the next couple of years. We have a vision for building healthy tribal economies that will advance our sovereign interests, not only as a matter of domestic policy, but foreign policy. I've had a chance to work with John Kerry in Scotland last year at the UN climate talks. It was the first time we were receiving diplomatic credentials to go outside of the United States to represent not only our interests, but the interests of Indigenous peoples in other parts of the world. We were re-invited back to Egypt for this last year's COP. And so I know that the opportunity that's on the horizon to advance tribal sovereignty interests, our economic agenda, our climate agenda is going to be truly historic. And quite frankly, I can imagine what that might be, but I have all the faith in the world that what we're going to accomplish is even far greater than what we could possibly imagine in this moment, in this hour. And that is our destiny. And I know that's what our ancestors have worked so hard for so long. And it's going to be our generation that gets to seize that moment.
Yes, and one thing I took note of, actually during the Obama administration, I was on a press call, and there was, as I recall, there was like 600 people on the call. And I remember at one point, somebody from the White House, and this is the Obama administration, said that we're not going to make any move until we hear from NCAI. And that has always stuck with me, to the strength of the National Congress of American Indians. And as president, how does that make you feel? Tell us about the interaction, and what does that really mean in terms of, and I know you don't want to take all the credit, because there's fine NARF is out there, the National Indian Health Board, but tell us about your position, your stance as president of NCAI. What does that really mean, and how do you interact with the White House on policy change?
Yes, the first thing I'd like to say just about that role, it's truly a humbling experience to occupy a position, to be the voice of all of Indian country. And I take that role quite seriously, not only as a matter of policy, but there's a spiritual dimension to the work that we do, and it is ancestral, and it is the inheritance that we've received. And as tribal leaders, it's a sacred duty, it's a sacred position that we all hold when we represent the voice of our citizens. And so when I think of the voice of Indian country, I not only see the voice of tribal leaders today, and I've had a chance to go across Indian country during the sovereignty run to see our landscape, to see our youth, our elders, our communities, but it's also the voice of those generations that have gone before us, and the voice of future generations yet to be born. And so as president of NCAI, when I speak on behalf of tribal nations, that's the full, unlimited, infinite spectrum of the voice that we carry, the voice that's in our DNA, the voice that's in our dreams and our hopes and our inspiration. And so it really is a humbling role and position. And so anytime we have engagement to talk about any issue, the first thing that's at front and center in my mind is the inherent sovereign interest. And that's a core mission of NCAI, is to advance the sovereign interests of not only tribal nations individually, but collectively, and the strength and the power that we have when we can enlist the voice of all of Indian country together on our common agenda. And so it really is an honor, a privilege, and it's truly a humbling experience. And I've appreciated every single day during the tenure of my presidency, from that very first day when I raised my right hand and took an oath of office. And every single day that I wake up, I'm excited. I'm thinking about what we can do. I'm thinking about how we can continue to make progress and inroads. And so it really is quite an experience.
Yes, and thank you for the work you're doing there. In October, you already mentioned this, the sovereignty run, October
Yes.
3rd. So as I recall, you embarked on the, 1,700-mile run from,
Yes.
was Oklahoma, was it Cherokee Nation, all the way to Sacramento. Tell us about that and why did you do it?
Yes. So the why goes back 20 years ago. So as a young attorney, I was called to Washington, D.C. During the Sovereignty Protection Initiative, September 11th, 2001. I was at the Hilton, just a couple blocks, or actually it was the Hyatt, a couple blocks from the White House, when Senator Inouye was addressing tribal leaders and announced that the towers had been hit, and we found ourselves instantly in a war zone. All access points to DC was shut down. Well, at the beginning of that year, and I go into a great deal of introspection around this time of the year, as well as reflection.
Mm-hmm.
And it was put on my heart to run a marathon in 2001, January 1st. And I'd never run a marathon. I don't even think I ran more than a mile or two at that point in my life. But by September, I'd been up to, 15, 18 miles. And the Seattle Marathon was scheduled November 25th. I found myself in a war zone. I came back. I was challenged. I drove home, and across the country, I realized that's why I was called to do this, was on the 1-year anniversary. We did the sovereignty run, the original run. We left Quinault, ran across the United States, and we arrived on the front steps of the U.S. Supreme Court on October. It was the first Monday of October, to announce that tribal sovereignty is alive and well. And despite all of the terrible decisions coming out of the United States Supreme Court, we stand united and strong. And so January 1, a year ago, it was on my heart. We need to do that again. I felt at the time it was a spiritual draw, just like it was 20 years prior. I felt Indian country had been through a lot. I knew we were prepared to come out. I knew there was I didn't know Castro versus Huerta was going to be on the horizon, but I knew Oklahoma was ground zero, and we had to enlist the voice of all of Indian country to come together to ground zero of tribal sovereignty attacks. And we wanted to run across the country, elevating the issue, and then arrive at the opening of our NCAI annual convention in Sacramento, which we did. And I can't tell you, I can't even begin to express in words the spiritual strength of this year's journey. We went into some of the most sacred sites of Indian country, including Oak Flat there in Arizona. And we were gathered in Oklahoma and surrounded by buffalo during a prayer. 800 buffalo surrounded us. And at the opening at Cherokee, when the elders sang Amazing Grace in the Cherokee language, the sun just broke and just got brighter and brighter. And so we knew that even before the run started, it was blessed, it was spiritual, and it was a way to unite all of Indian country together to stand for tribal sovereignty. And so there were so many memories along the way, and just personally as well as professionally, it was an experience that those of us that participated in the tribes that hosted, we'll never forget that moment and experience.
Yes, and unfortunately lost a brother in October, so I missed out. Our good friend Nedra Darling wanted me to be part of that, and I honestly just could not do it because of family obligations, obviously. But that was quite the thing, and we watched it from afar. And congratulations for that. And I really like that idea of bringing attention to tribal sovereignty, the strength of it, because we know it's under attack often, yes. and we know often those attacks happen in court systems. So, yes. Do you have a prediction on the Supreme Court ruling on Holland versus breaking?
It's going to be a close one. I believe that regardless of the decision, tribal nations, we know that we have an absolute inherent right to make a decision with respect to our children and the future of our children and the rightful place that they have within tribal nations. Right now, I want to say we're going to win. I believe that just hearing some of the arguments and some of the justices that said, we're convinced on the political relationship side, it may be favorable, but of course it's going to be one of those decisions. It's going to be mixed with a bunch of things that we're going to have to unravel once the decision is announced and really interpret. But I'm confident that regardless of the decision, there's no question that tribal nations are going to continue to stand. And if the decision is adverse to our interests, we're going to come back twice as strong, twice as hard with our friends and allies. And an adverse decision simply will not go unanswered, and it will not stand, not under the watch of this generation of tribal leaders. And so I'm very confident and hopeful the future that we have with respect to protecting our children, a full court press with the executive branch, with the legislative. And that's the thing, there's a system of checks and balances in this country. And when one branch of the government kind of goes off to the wrong direction, we have friends and allies to bring it back. And I'm just so very confident that we're going to continue to protect the interests of every single Native child born into this generation.
Yeah, and I really do appreciate what you just said. And I think that's, there again, speaks to the strength of the National Congress of American Indians being a strong voice for us in Washington, the nation's capital.
Yes.
And you mentioned earlier the advance appropriations, which was huge. Last week, passed Congress, the omnibus bill, and President Biden signed it last Friday. Why now? Why do you? Because my understanding, tribes have been fighting for this for decades, years, if not decades. Why now, Fawn? Why did it happen now? What was the magical moment?
I think it was a culmination of a lot of things. To your point about generations of tribal leaders have made this push. And I think if anything, the pandemic revealed just how vulnerable tribal nations are, just how vulnerable we are when we don't have the funding and the resources to protect basic things like quality of healthcare, like access to healthcare, and our ability to plan for the health needs of our citizens. And so when we had the highest rates of infection, the highest rates of death, and people were looking around, why are tribal citizens and tribal nations suffering at such a high and disproportionate level? Well, at the same time, we were making significant progress in achieving parity with state and local governments with respect to the CARES Act and American Rescue Plan, and having that position of equity. And then when you look at the metrics, the healthcare metrics, and how far off we are on some of these indices. And so I think it was just a lot of the things that we've been working on and advancing, a perfect storm of a global pandemic. We also have the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights Broken Promises report that Senator Elizabeth Warren announced at NCAI's annual convention. That has a lot of information with respect to healthcare metrics and needs and recommendations. And that's been the buzz on Capitol Hill that we've been advancing. Gosh, I think the first time we called for an update of the Quiet Crisis Report, it was when NCAI was in Atlanta, Georgia. I want to say it was pretty close to a decade ago. We've been working to try to shine some light on the chronic underfunding of basic things like healthcare. And that report is timely. It came at a time when a pandemic hit. And so I think it was just a culmination of a lot of things. And it was a moment in time where Indian country was able to unify all across every region to make that push, to make it happen. And we're not going to go back. We're going to continue to ensure that other mechanisms for funding Indian country are going to be stable. We paid the price. Treaties are non-negotiable. And so, again, this is another moment in time where we've made historical progress, and it's foundational to continue to advance for future generations.
Yes, that's strong, and I am so happy. And unfortunately, we look at our analytics every day for Native News Online during Christmas, and that's when it passed. Right at Christmas time, people aren't reading it, so we want to keep amplifying what happened as we go into the new year. Yes. Because I think Indian country needs to applaud what happened. Yes. and thank those senators and those Congress people who voted for it, and even the White House, the support. I got into the other day as I was preparing for this question, and I've been asking other people this week, why now? I went back to the Biden-Harris campaign promises, the plan that they had for Indian country is right in there.
Yes.
They said they're going to go for it, and I was like, "Wow, that's pretty significant." And that's one more promise that the president has made to Indian country. So it's really, really great. Hey, tell me this. I know you are a strong advocate for the environment.
Yes.
You even in some of your legal work prior to your involvement with your tribe, you've been a strong advocate. Tell me this. What's NCAI going to do about climate change, and what's coming up from 2023? Relating to that?
Yes, boy, that's a loaded question, and you're absolutely right. As you ask that question, I can almost see a book, chapter by chapter of what's on the horizon for Indian country. But let me just say this, that here in the state of Washington, we were successful in pricing carbon for the first time in U.S. history, holding industry accountable at $50 a metric ton. And we accomplished what no president of the United States has been able to accomplish, or any governor for that matter. And so we secured millions. I think the budget score is like $400 million annually in the state of Washington. 10% of those carbon revenues, a direct set aside for tribal nations. And we have seats on the decision-making panel that's going to appropriate these funds. And so that's millions of dollars. In the United States Congress, we secured $500 million, $500 million in the Inflation Reduction Act. And I point to the international opportunities. At the state level, it's millions. At the national level, it's billions. Globally and internationally, it's trillions of dollars. Just in one sector alone in carbon removal, it's 8.4 trillion annually between now and 2050. And the rest of the world, both the public and private sector, understands two things. They understand Indigenous peoples are on the front line and we're disproportionately impacted, and we have little to no resources. And so there's a massive global scale movement to enlist support and aid to Indigenous peoples. The unfortunate thing is, up until this point, in large part, that space has been occupied by NGOs and philanthropy and other interests that they'll use our images of Indigenous peoples. They'll get funding, but there's no direct connection between their funding source and actually doing things on the ground in a representative way. Like tribal nations. And in other parts of the world, Indigenous peoples are, they're living in the Amazon and northern Siberia. They don't have political structure. They don't have tribal councils that adopt climate policy. They don't have enterprise boards that manage large scale commercial interests that are ready to make these advancements. And so what I see happening over the course of the next year is a movement to put together a global entity that will receive significant resources and funding to deploy to the front lines. Because let's be clear about this. Even as massive as the Inflation Reduction Act was, $500 million, you divide that among 500 tribal nations, it's not even $1 million. There's no way the scale of that epic, large, historic piece of legislation will come close to doing what we need. And it's been very clear that the Biden administration, as well as others, know the public's treasury is not going to fund this. We're basically funding the symptoms of climate change from the public treasury, the hurricanes, tornadoes, mega fires, and it's only going to intensify. And this crisis demands public-private partnerships. And so I know that industry is in a period of transition. The market is applying pressure to corporations. Individual shareholders are suing boards for not managing their investment with considering climate risks. NASDAQ has an index now on climate risk. And so the market pressures are now forcing industry to do things. And as they look around to do things, we want to position tribal nations such that when you invest with us, you could take that to the bank. It's going to be a gold standard. Tribes are going to repatriate lands. Tribes are going to restore salmon habitat. Tribes are going to value water as a sacred resource. And so while all the different funding mechanisms that are going to flow through the Inflation Reduction Act, some of it's greenwashing, some of it's window dressing, all of that's going to pass. And we know in this moment in time, that's nowhere near the scale, nor is it nowhere near what's necessary to affect and confront the crisis of climate But tribal nations, when we create this entity and we're able to receive massive scale of funding and do the work that we know is minimally necessary over the course of time, we're going to create a different trajectory, because right now the US is still on this downward trajectory of not addressing the climate risk. And we're going to be able to come in and offer a whole nother opportunity. And as this crisis intensifies and the world looks around, where can we invest? It's going to be clear. Invest with sovereign tribal nations, both as a matter of public policy, commercially, economically. And I just know we're positioned to not only lead the United States in transitioning away from fossil fuel to renewable energy, but as we lead the United States, we're going to lead the world. And this is timely, and it's going to be tribal nations on the front line that are going to make all the difference in the world. And I just know that that's our calling. Our ancestors long predicted of this time when the world is not going to be sustainable, and it's going to be red nations rising to lead the rest of the world. And it's quite simple. It's leading the world back to the way the Creator intended, how we're supposed to relate to the natural world, how we're supposed to respect the natural world, how we're supposed to advocate for those that can't, the salmon that can't get out of the rivers to go to court and walk the halls of Congress. All of our relatives in the ocean, the air, and the forest. I mean, that's our duty and that's our calling. And we feel that just as strongly as we do about the survival of humanity and gifting to our future generations a healthy, clean, sustainable future. So I'll leave it at that. But there's a lot on the horizon. But that's, as I said, when you asked that question, I could see an entire book on this. And chapter by chapter, we're going to make all the difference in the world in 2023.
Well, and I understand that you have 10 months left of your term, and you are
Yes.
term limited. So,
Yes.
President Sharp, maybe that's your next project, writing a book.
Yes.
I mean, seriously, that would be fantastic, because you are so knowledgeable in what you said, and we know that there are tribes that are losing land, sinking into the water, and it's just from all the way from Florida all the way up to the Arctic Circle area. It's just really amazing, and you know all these things. And to our viewers, I just don't know if they know, and so we may have to have you come back on, and we'll just, instead of talking about the end of the year and what's going into the next year, maybe we'll have you come back on and talk about the environment, because you are such a strong proponent of that. So, any last words to the audience for 2023 as we move forward?
Yes. The last word I'd like to say, a year ago, January 1st, I picked up the phone and I called my dear friend, Nedra Darling. And I said, Nedra, I feel very strongly, it's on my heart. I want to be laser focused in supporting Bright Path Strong to ensure that Jim Thorpe's standing is restored, and that he is the sole winner of the gold medals. And I'm telling you, by July, that happened. And we are so incredibly honored to stand with Bright Path Strong in partnership. And they were our partner all across Indian country on the sovereignty run. And we had a chance to go to Sac and Fox, and I met Jim's granddaughter. And I heard the stories of how he was prepared to be laid to rest, and people came and confiscated his body. And there's that whole other injustice that we no doubt will address. But just hearing and being in that place where he was born, where he lived, his spirit was alive with us all across the sovereignty run. And so I just know that that's a whole nother issue that we set out to accomplish. We did, and we're going to continue to stand firm with Bright Path Strong and their core mission. A film is going to be made about his life story. They're going to start production next summer. I'm just so thrilled and excited to be part of it. I'm an athlete. I absolutely love sports, and to know that the greatest athlete to ever live is Jim Thorpe, and a native. And when I saw his life-size poster when we were in Gallup, New Mexico, I saw it in a different way. I saw not just an athlete, a life-size athlete, but I could see that behind him it was generations, and in his DNA were generations of warriors, generations of strength and resilience. And so when we honored Oren Lyon at our gala event in Sacramento, our annual, I stood right next to Oren, and as he told the story of shaking Jim Thorpe's hand And I thought, how truly blessed we are by God to be able to serve with our heroes and our sheroes present day. And so that's the last point I want to say. It was something we set out to do January 1, 2020. And by July, all of Indian country came together. And I'm just so grateful for my dear friend, Nedra Darling. She was a champ. She came out with us on the sovereignty run. And it's a run I'll never forget for as long as I live.
And you know what? Thank you for that comment on that. And Nedra, she and I are really good friends, and we're same tribal nation, Prairie Band Potawatomi. And I'll have you know, Jim Thorpe's son, William, told me that Jim had more Potawatomi blood than he did Sac and Fox. So I just had I had to throw that in for good measure. So, and thank you very much, Chief McGwitch, for coming on Native Bidaské. We will have you on again. I really would like to explore more and amplify the need in Indian country for climate change and environments on and that. So we'll give you back on, President Sharp, and Happy New Year to you.
Yes, Siakwil, thank you. I'll be heading to Davos, Switzerland, January 14th. It'll be the first time that tribal nations will be engaging with the global business community around the core agenda that I just expressed. So I'd be happy to come back and further amplify that with you. Always willing. And thank you again, Levi, for your leadership and providing us this opportunity. Siakwil.
Okay, thank you, Chief McGwitch. And to our viewers, thank you for coming on, watching another episode of Native Bidaské. We started Native Bidaské in March of this year. It's been very successful. We have thousands of people watching us, and we will continue on 2023. And Happy New Year to everyone. Chief McGwitch.
Happy New Year.
If you appreciate what we do here at Native News Online, we invite you to donate to support our continued work covering Indian country. You can scan this code with your smartphone or go to the link located below this video to donate today. We greatly appreciate your support. Please be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And be sure to scan this code or go to the link below to subscribe to our newsletter. Thank you for joining us today, and please be sure to join us again next week for another episode of Native Bidaské. Chief McGwitch.